Okay, so in this video we'll talk a bit about abstraction. We'll move on to indentation and execution flows. So what is abstraction? Abstraction is basically pushing a button and forgetting about anything that's going on and just getting an output. So when you call someone, you just go to your smartphone and press your contact and press talk, and then you're talking to somebody. So you don't really think about anything going on in the software of your phone and the hardware of your phone, how your phone's connecting to the other person. It doesn't matter. You're pushing a button, and all of that is an example of abstraction. You don't know any of the implementation details, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's very useful to have all these sort of abstractions in life. But the point is to get an idea for what abstraction is. It's reducing complexity and information by hiding it, by hiding the implementation details. So let's think about it in terms of coding, in terms of Python. So in this case, you don't necessarily have to write any of this in Python, but just sort of get an idea for how you would write it in a code. We can create a new text file here. Try this.txt. And in this text file, we can write down these two different methods of writing a program. So method 1. So in method 1, we're trying to boil an egg, and you have three functions which you can use. And let's just say that these three functions cover all of the different things that you have to do to boil an egg. So first you're going to locate the pot, and let's assume that the function will, when you call the function, it will do all of the things necessary to find the pot. Let's say you then set up your egg, and we can call this whatever we want, the parameter name, when we call it. But don't think too much about this. I can just copy the same name to avoid confusion. The point we're trying to get across is that this first step is finding the pot. The second step is basically getting your egg, putting it in the pot, and the third step is boil your egg. And by calling three functions, you're doing the whole thing. Now, are these the right steps to boil an egg? I would say probably not. You probably want to boil your water and then put the egg in and time it for exactly 7 minutes and get a perfect boiled egg. But let's not think too much about that either. Let's just realize that when we call functions, we are making our lives easier. Method 2, if we don't have functions to use, then we have to spell out all of the steps. So let's say you're sitting in the kitchen, you have your eyes closed, maybe you have to open your eyes, and then you have to look towards the cabinet, and then you have to sit up, walk towards the cabinet, lift your right arm, grab the cabinet handle, and so on and so on and so on. So all of these different statements might all be within the locate pot function. And yes, if you were writing this function yourself, you would have to write all these steps once, but only once. So it's useful, especially if you have to call a function multiple times, which you definitely could in a program. It's also useful for readability, because you're really only having to deal with the statements that you write, and the functions that you call only take up a small amount of space compared to writing all of the steps like this. So method 1 definitely seems easier, and it's because we're using abstraction. Just like when you make a phone call, you're touching a button instead of having to connect the phone call yourself and all those things. So let's move on to indentation. Just a note about indentation. In this function, we have the definition of the function in the first line, def, and when we hit enter, in PyCharm it'll automatically tab to the first line of the body of the function. Now, this is important because it's a syntax issue if you don't tab or space. So let's say I'm defining a function. PyCharm will automatically do that for you, but if you don't tab or if you don't indent, you're going to get a indentation error, which is a form of a syntax error. But with indentation, I just wanted to mention that you don't have to necessarily do a tab. You could do one space or two spaces or any number of spaces. Typically, by convention, we use either 4 spaces or a tab. But whatever you do use, just try to be consistent. Because if you're not, you could run into issues, especially when we start doing conditionals, if-else statements, and things like this. So another very important point is execution flow. Execution flow being the flow of execution through a program. So how does the interpreter execute your program? Well, it'll start from the top and go to the bottom. Simple enough, but when the interpreter finds a function, it doesn't actually go through the function first time through. It will notice that there's a function, do stuff, but instead of going into the body of the function, it will skip this and move on to the next statement. So x equals 2. So in what order are these lines processed? Well, we start with line 1, then we move to line 7 and 8, and so on. And just to go through this question, and just so that you have the answer on you, we start with line 1, we skip over to line 7, then to line 8, and then to line 9. We call the function doStuff, which takes us back to line 1, and then the interpreter finally goes into the body of the function because we've called it here. So from line 1 we go to line 2, line 3, line 4, line 5, and then finally we return back to line 9 where we're printing the value. So that's it for this video. In the next video we'll go over function values.